Hello and welcome back. In the previous video, we created an item count variable of type int32 on the item class, and in pickup widget BP, we bound the number to that variable value. We also made it edit anywhere so that we could edit this on an instance in the game, or we could simply edit it in the blueprint. In this video, we would like to create a rarity property which will determine how many stars show up on the item widget. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I'm back here in item.h, and for the rarity, I'd like to create an enum. That way each rarity is a little bit more descriptive than, say, just a number. So I'm going to scroll up above the class declaration, and I'm going to come just below the includes and create an enum. So let's type enum class. This is going to be a scoped enum, and we're going to call it e-item rarity. I'm going to make this enum contain the type uint8 because we don't really need a whole bunch of enum constants, and we don't need their values to go up very high. We're only going to have a few rarity categories. Now I'm going to call our first constant EIR underscore damaged. And EIR stands for E-item rarity. Now we're going to give this enum class a uenum macro. And in the uenum macro, we're going to give this the blueprint type specifier, and this allows us to create a blueprint based on this enum type if we want to. Now, uenums need to be prefixed with an E, and that's why we call this E-item rarity rather than just item rarity. Now, for EIR damaged, we can use a uMeta macro, and this allows us to give it a display name, and I'm going to call this damaged. And this way, if we ever do create a blueprint based on this enum, then its display name will be damaged rather than EIR damaged. So it'll make a little bit more sense in blueprints. But it's usually good convention to have an abbreviation before the enum constant, so that way it's pretty clear that this belongs to the e-item rarity enum. So we have a category called damaged. I'm going to add a second category by copying this line and pasting it below, and I'm going to call this common. And for the display name, we'll just call it common. So we have two rarity categories. I'm going to copy and paste this line, and the next one I'll call uncommon. And I'll have the display name be uncommon. Let's copy and paste this, and we'll call the next one rare, and the display name can be rare. And finally, we'll paste another one and call this one legendary. And the display name, legendary. Now, we're going to add one final one, and I'm just going to call this EIR max, and the display name can be default max. So this way we have a final enum constant here called max. Now I don't need the comma for that, so make sure that there's no comma. And now we've defined our e-item rarity enum. Now we can add a variable to item.h of type e-item rarity. So let's do this in the private section. Down here at the bottom of the private section, we'll go ahead and create a variable of type e-item rarity, and let's call this item rarity. Let's give it a uProperty, and I'm going to make this edit anywhere, and I'll make it blueprint read only, and I'll give it the same category and meta specifier as the others. Now let's give this a comment, and we'll say item rarity determines number of stars in pickup widget. And finally, we can initialize this in the constructor. So up here at the top, we'll add item rarity, and we can initialize this to a default value of e-item rarity. And why don't we just make the default value common? Okay, so how is this going to affect the number of stars in our pickup widget? Well, we know the widget will have 5 possible stars. So what I'd like to do is add a variable that can represent whether or not each of those 5 stars is active. So this can be a t-array, and I'm going to make this a t-array that holds bools. So t-array bool, and let's call this active stars. Now I'm going to give it a u property, and I'm going to make this visible anywhere, blueprint read only, and we'll give it the same category and meta specifier as the other variables. And the reason I want this only to be visible is because this should be set here in C++ code based on the item rarity. So if you change the item rarity, then the active stars should change. So this should be a Boolean. It's going to have 5 elements, and they'll be true or false based on whether or not that particular star should be visible in the widget. So let's make a function that can set these active stars appropriately. So I'm going to create a function and put it up here in the protected section, and it's going to be void, and we'll call it set active stars. And for the comment, we'll say sets the active stars array of booleans or of bools based on rarity. Okay, let's give this a function body. So how are we going to define set active stars? Well, first let's go ahead and make sure that active stars has some values inside of it. Now here's the pickup widget. There are 5 stars total. So we need our active stars array to hold 5 elements. So first we need to add 5 bool values to our active stars array. So let's make a for loop, and we'll say int32 I equals 0, and we'll loop until I is less than or equal to 5, and we'll use an I++ here. Now, if you know your for loops, you'll know that less than or equal to 5 means that this will loop from I equals 0 to I equals 5, resulting in a total of 6 array elements. And that's because I don't want to use the 0 element. So I'm going to comment this and say the 0 element isn't used. And that's because I'd like for the array index to correspond to that star number. So the first star will correspond to active stars of 1. So in the for loop, we're simply going to add to active stars. Remember, this is a t-array that stores booleans. So we can use the add function for the t-array, and we need to add a boolean value. We're simply going to initialize all of the elements to false. Now next, we need to check the value of the eItem rarity variable and set the stars accordingly. We can do this with a switch statement. So we can switch on item rarity. And so we're going to have a case for each rarity. Okay, so for our first case, we're going to check to see if item rarity has the value eItem rarity, and the lowest rarity is damaged. So we'll start with that. Now we need a break statement because the strange thing about switch statements is when it hits a case, it will then continue to execute all the rest of the cases until it hits a break. So we need a break in each case. Now, in the case of damaged, we're going to set active stars of element 1 to true. See here in pickup widget BP, there's 5 stars, and we're going to check that array and see if element 1 is true. If so, we can display this first star. So that's the case for item rarity being damaged. Now let's do the next case. In the case that item rarity has the value eItem rarity common, which is the next rarity up, we'll add a break. And in this case, we're going to set active stars of 1 to true, but we're also going to set active stars of 2 to true. Now we're going to do the same thing for the next case. So we can copy this case and paste it here, and instead of common, we're going to do the next rarity up, which is uncommon. And in uncommon, we're going to set 1 and 2 to true in active stars, and we're also going to set active stars of 3 to true. Now we can copy this case and paste it, and instead of uncommon, this time we're going to go with rare, which is the next rarity. And for rare, we're setting 1, 2, 3, and 4 to true. So we're setting 4 of the elements to true. Now finally, let's copy this case and we'll paste it. And for this rarity, we're going to select legendary. That's the highest rarity. And in the case of legendary, we're going to set 1 through 5, all of them to true. Okay, so we've got this function that first adds 6 elements to the array. We're not going to use the 0th element. And depending on rarity, it sets some of the elements in active stars to true, corresponding to which slots on the pickup widget we want to show stars in. So we can take this function setActiveStars and we can call it in begin play. So let's go up here to begin play. And we'll call this just after we set visibility for pickup widget. And by the way, we're just accessing pickup widget without checking it. We should actually be saying if pickup widget, because in the case that pickup widget is null, this could get us into trouble and cause a crash. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick this if check there. And we also have setActiveStars. So let's comment this and say sets active stars array based on item rarity. Okay, let's go ahead and compile our code. Okay, so we're back at the editor and I'm going to click on the first star and make sure I have star 1 icon selected. Now here in the appearance section, we'll see that we've hard-coded this star icon. Now we want to make this icon either visible or invisible based on the Boolean in our active stars array. If it's true, we really don't need to do anything because the star is already visible. But if it's false, we should hide the star. We can hide the star by setting its opacity. In other words, we can turn its alpha all the way down to 0. If you take the alpha here in color and opacity and set that alpha to 0, then you'll see that the star is no longer visible. Well, we can go ahead and create a binding for color and opacity by clicking bind and create binding. Now we have this function that takes a linear color structure and we can set the alpha on this depending on the active stars array. Now if we right click on return value and promote this to a variable, we can call this variable return color. Now if we compile, we can take our return color and down here for the default value, we can open the drop down and you'll see that by default everything is 0. With all of these set to 0, if we hit play and take a look, we'll see that that first star is now no longer visible because its alpha is 0. So we can set that alpha either to 1 or 0 based on whether or not this star should be visible, and we're going to use that active stars array to determine that. Now we're going to set the RGB values all to 1 because we don't want to change the color, we only want to change alpha. So we need to get that active stars array. So let's get our item reference. We'll check to see if it's valid using an isValid node. And if it is valid, then we need that active stars array. So we can type get active stars, and we'll see this icon here that looks like a grid. That says that it's an array, and it's color coded. Red means Boolean, so we can tell that this is a Boolean array from right here. Go ahead and click that, and we now have active stars array. Now this is for the first icon, and we need to just get that first element, the element at index 1 of the array. So we can use a get node, and we're able to get a copy or a reference to what is in the array. This is a Boolean, so it doesn't matter whether we get a copy or a reference. A Boolean is a small size in memory, so we can just get a copy of this element. And we're going to change the element index to 1. This will get us the Boolean stored in index 1 of the active stars array. We're just going to check this Boolean to see if it's true or false. So I'm going to hold B and click, and that gives me a branch. And the condition will be the value at active stars of 1. So I'll hook up the isValid pin to the branch. And we're going to do one of two things. If the Boolean is true, we're going to set the value of return color so that it has a alpha of 1. So let's get return color, drag it in, and set return color. And we can create a couple of variables of type linear color that we can use to set these, one for true, one for false. So let's add a new variable, and we'll call this visible alpha, and we'll change its variable type to linear color. We'll hit compile, and we'll set its default values to have ones for the RGB and 1 for the alpha, so everything is 1. And we'll use this for setting return color in the case that the active stars element is true. We can also create a new variable of type linear color, and we'll call this hidden alpha. And we can compile this, and we'll see that everything is 0, including the alpha, so we can just leave it as is. So in the false case, we can take our set return color node, duplicate that, and we'll set this to hidden alpha. So that's for the false case. In either case, we're going to plug the output into return node, and we're returning return color. So we can compile this. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking item reference, we're getting active stars, and we're getting the value at the element 1 of active stars. We're checking that value because it's a Boolean. If it's true, we're setting the return color to visible alpha, which has a value of 1, and if it's false, we're setting return color to hidden alpha, which has an alpha of 0. Okay, so this takes care of the first star. Back in the designer, we're going to click on the second star, star 2 icon, and we're going to bind the color and opacity for this one as well. So click bind and create binding. Now for this one, we're still going to use return color for the return value, and we're going to do the same exact thing that we did in the star 1 icon binding. So we can copy all these nodes and get back into the star 2 icon function and paste these nodes in here. So I'll hook up the pin to the isValid here in the beginning, and we'll hook up both of these set return color nodes to return node. The only difference is this get here needs to take a value of 2 because this is the second star. Now we're starting to see that we're reusing a whole bunch of nodes, so we could make a function that takes an integer for its input and returns a linear color for its output. And that way we only have to call this function each time we bind our color and opacity. So why don't we just do that? Let's highlight all these nodes here, right-click, and select Collapse to Function. Now this function can be get star opacity. And get star opacity can have an input, so down here in the details panel, let's add new parameter, and we'll change this to the integer type, and we'll call this active star index. And we can add an output for this function, so add an output, click on new parameter here. This will be of type linear color, and we'll call this star alpha. Now for the get star opacity function, let's double click that, and we can see inside that it looks like our nodes are a little jumbled, so let's separate those. And what we do is we get our item reference and get our active stars array, and we get an element from that array. Well, we're just going to use the input for this function that we just created, active star index. We're going to plug that into the get. And for the return node, we simply need to return our return color. So let's find that return color variable here, and we'll plug that in. And hook up these pins here. And let's click on return color here. Now we want this return color variable to be local to this function. In other words, we don't want it to affect anything outside of this function. So rather than using just a regular variable, let's create a new variable and make this a local variable this time and call this return, and we'll say return alpha because really we don't care about the color. It's alpha anyway. Make sure the type is linear color, and we'll drag out return alpha here and use a setter, And instead of return color, we're going to set return alpha. So replace this return color setter with return alpha instead. We'll do that for this one as well. So return alpha, we'll get a setter, and we'll set it to the hidden alpha down here. We'll delete that and use these two instead. And instead of return color for star alpha, we're going to use return alpha like that. And now we don't need our return color variable that belongs to pickup widget BP. Now this function getStarOpacity uses a local variable return alpha. So now we have this nice little function that we can use in our other bindings. So here in getStar2 icon, we have getStarOpacity, and instead of return color, we're just going to return what's returned from getStarOpacity. And because this is the star 2 icon, we're going to put a value of 2 here in the input. Now that looks a lot more clean. Let's go back to our binding for getStar1 icon, and instead of this big old mess, let's delete all these nodes, and instead we'll make a function call to getStarOpacity. So here up in functions, drag that in, drag out the return node, and star alpha is returned. We'll plug that in for the return value. We'll hook up the input here, and for the active star index, we're going to use the star index 1. Beautiful. Now we're not using that return color variable anymore, so we can go ahead and delete that. We don't need it anymore. So now we have set the bindings for star 1 and star 2. We're now ready to go back to the designer and select the third star called star 3 icon, and go down here to color and opacity and create a new binding for the third star. Now for the third star, all we need to do is scroll up and call getStarOpacity. We're calling that. We're using the return value for that. And for the star index, since this is the third star, we're going to pass in 3. That'll get the Boolean in the active stars array at index 3. Perfect. Now back in Designer, we'll select the fourth star. We'll create a binding for the color and opacity. And in this binding, again, we're just going to call getStarOpacity. We're going to plug these pins in. We're going to hook up the output star alpha to the return value. And for active star index, we'll put in a 4. And lastly, we're going to go back to the designer and select star 5 icon. Go to its color and opacity, create binding, and we'll simply call getStarOpacity here. We're going to do the same exact thing. The only difference is active star index for this one will be 5. Perfect. Now back in the designer, we'll see that each of these 5 stars has its opacity bound based on that element in the active stars array that we created in C++. So why don't we go back into the level here and select our first weapon here. And in the details panel, we'll search for rarity and we'll see our enum item rarity. And so we'll see that this has the default value of common, which if you'll recall, we set the default value of item rarity in the constructor to common. Now we can set this to anything like, say, rare, which means we'll expect 4 stars. And let's select this other weapon here, which has an item rarity of common. Let's go ahead and select damaged, which for this case we would expect 1 star. I'm going to open a new viewport so we can see this in full screen. And I'll go ahead and hit Alt-P to play. I'll engage, and let's take a look at these widgets. For this one, we set it to rare, and we only get 4 stars as expected. For this one, we only see 1 star because we set its rarity to common. Okay, so we can test out all of the cases by creating 5 different weapons, each with its own rarity. So I'll drag the damaged weapon over there, and then I'll hold Alt and drag out to create a duplicate. Let's close out a full screen here so I can get the details panel. And for this second weapon, I'm going to set the rarity to common. I'm going to select the third one here. I'm going to set its rarity to uncommon, and then I'll go ahead and duplicate this one. I'll set this fourth one to have a rare rarity, and then finally I'll drag out another copy and set this one's rarity to legendary. Okay, I'm going to go to full screen again, and let's test this out. So I'll go to the first one, and we'll see that this one is damaged. It has a single star. That's good. The second has 2 stars because it's common. The third has 3 stars because it's uncommon. The fourth has 4 stars because it has the rarity. And finally, the fifth one has 5 stars because it's legendary. So there we have it. We set the rarity on the weapon, and each one has its pickup widget reflect the rarity by the number of stars. Perfect. So that's going to conclude this video. In the next video, we're going to work on equipping a weapon because so far our character's weapon is simply part of its mesh. So in the next video, rather than just using that part of her mesh that looks like a gun, we're going to hide that gun part of her mesh, and we're going to have her actually use an object of the weapon class and spawn that and attach it to her mesh. So we'll do that in the next video.